I'd testified in over 60 courtrooms across 22 states in front of juries, judges, federal panels, even a few congressional committees. But no matter how high the stakes, my voice never shook. That morning, I stood before a federal judge in a quiet, wood-paneled courtroom in D.C., presenting my findings in a wrongful termination suit involving a major defense contractor. The room was packed with attorneys in tailored suits, legal interns scribbling notes, and one bored clerk chewing gum too loudly. I didn't flinch. I never did. I'd built my reputation on precision and calm under pressure. After all, financial narratives didn't just speak for themselves. Someone had to make them compelling. I was that someone. My name is Dr. Camille Hartley. I'm a forensic economist, which means, among other things, I spend my days unraveling the economic damages hidden in decades of balance sheets and boardroom decisions and explaining them in a way 12 strangers in a jury box can understand. I've been told I make complex data sound like common sense, but this wasn't just talent. It was years of work. Quiet work. Hartley & Associates was my father's firm and name, but it had long been my machine. I had designed our methodology. I'd brought in our biggest clients, national law firms, class action leaders, even federal agencies. I built the systems we used to analyze cases and created the framework that got us admitted as expert witnesses in the first place. But you wouldn't have known that if you looked at our website, or our annual reports, or our client events. Because the name on the signage, George Hartley, always stood front and center. Mine was in the footnotes. Just the way he liked it. I didn't resent it, not really. I wasn't in it for applause. I liked the work, the logic, the courtroom rhythm. I liked knowing I could walk into a high-stakes negotiation or a billion-dollar trial and hold my own. What I didn't like was being told year after year that your time will come as if recognition were a favor and not a consequence of results. As the judge called for a short recess, I gathered my files, made a mental note of the remaining cross-examination points, and returned to the bench where our lead counsel gave me a quiet nod of approval. We had them. The numbers were airtight. That's when I felt my phone buzz. It was a text from my father. Dinner, this Sunday. Just us and Preston. Important family update. I stared at it longer than I should have. Preston. That name alone slowed my breath. Preston was my younger brother by 6 years, charming, loud, forever floating between ventures. He had a podcast now, or maybe it was a YouTube channel, something about disrupting financial systems and new age money. Last I checked, he'd trademarked a phrase called emotional economics. I still wasn't sure what that meant. He'd never shown interest in the family firm, never even interned. But my father had always talked about him with a softness I'd never seen directed my way. I was the stable one, the thinker, the technician. Preston, he was the spark. At least in our parents' eyes. The courtroom reconvened. I stood again and returned to my testimony like nothing had changed. But something had. I didn't know what that message meant, not yet, but I felt a shift in my gut, a tension that curled and sat heavy beneath my ribs. It wasn't the kind of nervous energy I usually carried into litigation. It was the kind that precedes betrayal. It started with the sound of his laugh, loud, familiar, and coming from the kitchen, just as I stepped into the house. My parents lived in the same red brick colonial outside Annapolis where we'd grown up, a place that hadn't changed since the late 90s, right down to the ceramic fruit bowl on the counter and the mahogany dining table polished for every occasion. But that laugh, Preston's laugh, instantly shifted the atmosphere. It didn't belong in this house. It belonged on the other end of a live stream playing to a crowd of followers who thought he'd invented financial literacy. He stood by the island, tall-tanned and wearing a navy blue Henley shirt with the sleeves pushed up just enough to show off a tattoo I didn't recognize. His hair was styled a little too perfectly and his smile widened when he saw me. "Camille," he said, dragging the name out like a performance. Still with the neutral tones, I see. I offered a closed smile. "Preston, I see you're still dressing like your followers are watching." He grinned, unfazed. "Always got to stay on brand." Our mother appeared with a dish towel in one hand, practically beaming. "Isn't it wonderful having both of you here at the same time again?" I kissed her cheek and moved past Preston to take a seat at the far end of the table. Dad emerged from his study a moment later holding 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to Preston first, then passed the other to me. That order wasn't lost on me. George Hartley was nothing if not intentional. Dinner unfolded like a show. Preston narrated stories of business retreats in Costa Rica, a TEDx talk he'd almost booked, and a crypto-backed startup he'd advised, though when pressed, he couldn't recall whether they sold supplements or smartwatches. My father laughed too hard at all of it, clapping him on the back while I watched from across the table, cutting my steak with silent precision. At one point, Preston pulled out his phone to show us his latest video. It's got 500,000 views already. People really respond to rawness, transparency. No corporate masks. Is that what this is? I asked, dryly nodding toward his screen, which displayed a reel of him meditating on a balcony with ocean waves edited in. He smirked. It's brand narrative. You'd be surprised what converts. Dad chuckled and turned to me. You two are such opposites. Camille ever the analyst, Preston the communicator. Maybe that's why you complement each other so well? I almost choked on my sip of wine. Compliment. That word hung in the air like it meant something more. I caught a glance between Dad and Preston, brief, but knowing and the discomfort I'd felt in the courtroom returned only sharper now. After dessert, we migrated to the living room where Dad, swirling his whiskey, steered the conversation to Hartley and Associates. We're doing well, he said more to Preston than to me. Still getting steady federal contracts, mostly from the DOJ and class action firms. But I've been thinking about the next phase. I leaned back, cautious. Next phase, Dad nodded. Our name has credibility, sure, but we're mature. Institutional. I've been wondering whether it's time for a refresh. Something bold. Something modern. I raised an eyebrow. Modern, Preston jumped in. He's right. I mean, I've looked at the firm's website. It's fine. Very 2010, doesn't scream innovation, doesn't tell a story. You've got Camille's genius-level analytics, but no one outside the courtroom even knows what you do. We do work that stands on evidence, not buzzwords, I replied. Exactly, Preston said, as if agreeing. But imagine combining the evidence with digital storytelling, video explainers, interactive reports, maybe even a public-facing dashboard showing real-time economic trends. Sponsored by Hartley and Associates. Dad leaned forward, intrigued. That's not a bad idea. I blinked. You're serious? Times are changing, he said. The next generation of clients expects accessibility. Visibility. Preston has experience in that space. Influencing is not the same as expert testimony, I said. The court doesn't care about your view count. Preston raised a brow. Says the woman whose last client quote ended with, "Thank you for translating calculus into common sense." Courts care about clarity, and clarity is a form of communication. Something I happen to be good at. I didn't argue. I just looked at my father. He was nodding, thinking, weighing. Something deep in my chest shifted like a floorboard about to give way. I've been thinking, Dad said slowly, maybe it's time we brought in a different kind of partner. Someone who could reposition the firm for the next decade. Camille, of course, you'd stay in your role. Your technical leadership is critical, but maybe we let Preston lead the brand side. Strategy, vision. I stared at him. You want to split the firm's direction between us? Not split, he said. Evolve. That word evolve cut sharper than it should have. Because I knew what it really meant. It meant I'd been foundational. But Preston was the future. And the worst part, my father actually believed that. I stood to leave soon after. I had an early deposition the next morning and no stomach for whatever this conversation had turned into. As I walked to the door, Preston called after me. No hard feelings, Cam. The old ways just need a little disruption. I turned back with a faint smile. Try disrupting a federal judge, Preston? Let me know how that works out. The invitation arrived by email, unusual for my father, who typically called for family gatherings the old-fashioned way with a phone call and a vague mention of Sunday dinner in his clipped, no-nonsense tone. But this one had subject lines a time, a dress code, and even an RSVP. The sender, his executive assistant. The location. Not the usual home kitchen, but the Riverstone Club downtown, a private dining room with glass walls and a panoramic view of the harbor. Something was definitely different. I clicked yes without replying. I didn't need to. I already knew what this was. My father had finally decided to formalize the transition. And given the way he'd spoken to me after court the week prior, how he'd used words like critical and visionary to describe my role, I had little doubt. I'd been patient, quiet, strategic, always delivering results, never demanding recognition. This dinner would be the moment it all turned. Finally, he was going to name me managing partner. When I arrived, the hostess greeted me by name and led me past a series of velvet-curtained booths into a sleek private room. Soft jazz hummed in the background. The table was set for 5. My mother, impeccable in navy silk, was already seated. Preston lounged beside her in an open-collared shirt and what looked like suede sneakers. My father stood near the fireplace, drink in hand, dressed more formally than usual. He turned as I entered. "Camille," he said, smiling in that quiet, reserved way that always felt more ceremonial than sincere. "Good. We're all here." We weren't. Not quite. A 5th guest soon appeared, Andrew Rivas' dad's longtime attorney, who gave me a brief, apologetic nod as he took the final seat. I arched an eyebrow but said nothing. If Dad wanted legal documentation on hand for the announcement, so be it. I'd earned it. Dinner began with pleasantries, which meant my mother asking about my latest case while not really listening, and Preston recounting the viewership numbers on his latest webinar. 12,000 people live, he said, proudly gesturing with his wine glass. And that's not even including the replay numbers. "That's impressive," Mom said, clearly unsure what she was applauding. I focused on my filet, chewing slowly, calculating how long until the announcement. When Dad finally rose with his glass and cleared his throat, I straightened in my seat, fingers instinctively brushing a lock of hair behind my ear. "Here it comes," he began, as expected. "We're here tonight," he said, not just as a family, but as the stewards of something we built together. Hartley and Associates isn't just a firm, it's our legacy. It represents excellence, integrity, and the future of how we understand financial truth in legal systems. Camille, you've carried that mission with unmatched precision. Your expertise has elevated us. He paused. I felt warmth rise to my chest. My mother gave me a soft, approving smile. Preston tapped his fork idly against his water glass. Dad continued, "But legacy isn't just about maintaining excellence, it's about adapting, about evolution." And after deep reflection conversations with our board and advice from trusted colleagues, I've decided that the best path forward is bold transformation. I nodded slightly already, forming the words I'd say in response. Gracious, visionary, collaborative. Which is why, when he said the next line, I didn't register it at first. That's why effective. Immediately, I'll be transferring full operational control and ownership of Hartley and Associates to Preston. The room didn't fall silent. It froze. It took several seconds for my brain to process the sentence. My wine glass hovered in midair. I lowered it slowly, unsure if I'd misheard, but Preston was already smiling. Not shocked, not humbled. Smiling like someone who'd already practiced his acceptance speech. Dad went on, as if announcing a birthday toast. Camille will, of course, remain in her current position as principal economist and technical lead. Her contributions are invaluable. But Preston will take over strategic direction branding and client engagement, ushering us into the next decade. I looked to my mother, waiting for her to say something to register the insanity of it all, but she just placed a hand lightly on mine and said, "You've always been so good at what you do, sweetheart. This doesn't change that." It changed everything. Preston leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest. "I've already got a few ideas," he said, reaching into his messenger bag. Did a little mock-up of the new site. Cleaner visuals, personal touch, video forward interface. He slid a tablet down the table toward me. On the screen was a rebranded homepage, white background, gold serif font, and Preston's face dead center beneath the tagline, Economics Humanized. I didn't touch it. Dad chuckled. "We'll need your help on the technical side, of course. Your models are the bedrock of everything we do. But Preston will be crafting the message going forward." I swallowed hard. So, I'm supposed to be the engine while he drives the car. Dad blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. It's not like that. No, I said, voice even. Because that's exactly what it sounds like. Camille. My mother said gently, this isn't a demotion. It's a realignment. Of what sanity I could have argued. I could have reminded them that Preston had never so much as reviewed a case file or survived a single expert cross-examination. That the systems he mocked were the same ones that had kept the firm free of litigation for 15 years. That I had built those federal relationships, that I'd sacrificed birthdays, vacations, weekends for this. But I said nothing, because nothing I said would matter. The decision had already been made. I looked down at the untouched crème brûlée in front of me. My spoon trembled as I reached for it. I set it down. When dinner ended, Preston offered me a ride back to my place. I declined. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Cam, he said as I gathered my coat. There's room for both of us in this. I didn't look at him. No, Preston. There never was. I drove home with my music off, just the sound of the road and the soft hum of my own heartbeat still unsteady. When I stepped into my apartment, I didn't pour wine. I didn't cry. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed a subject line I'd never imagined sending. Resignation effective immediately. I wrote it carefully, 2 pages, no emotion, just facts, clear bullet points outlining transition plans, open case files, key contacts. I attached the audit logs, the compliance framework, and access credentials stripped of my own personal information. And then I saved one last folder, a private one, the backup. The systems I'd built weren't just spreadsheets, they were the very language of credibility. And if that language was going to be handed off to someone who barely spoke it, I needed insurance. I stared at the screen for a long time after clicking send. Not because I had doubts, but because it felt like morning. Not the end of a job, but the end of an identity I'd spent 15 years carving out. They didn't just pass me over, they erased me, but the story wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, I was at my desk by 5:30 a.m., the city outside, still sleeping, my apartment silent, save for the hum of my laptop and the slow breath of consequence settling into my bones. I had always believed in clean exits. No drama, no burned bridges, just the facts, the files, and a closed door left respectfully behind. This would be no different. By 6 Ur, I had already drafted a multi-tabbed transition plan. Every active case was logged in a color-coded spreadsheet with notes on deliverables, deadlines, and the appropriate point of contact. I left detailed memos for each team lead mapping out where things stood and what needed escalation. Passwords were transferred, permissions updated, my final act of stewardship. What I didn't do was include the strategic forecasting models I'd built over the past 5 years. Those weren't firm property. They were mine. I had developed them on my own time, tested them, improved them through fieldwork and case analysis. They were what gave our firm the edge when it came to trial exhibit settlement estimates and financial damage projections. They were also the reason I had the ear of half the managing partners at top litigation firms on the East Coast. I created an encrypted archive of those models, saved it to a personal drive, and logged out of my credentials for the last time. I didn't delete anything, I didn't need to, but I did lock access to one critical file, the Hartley financial compliance tree. Without that, they'd be flying blind. At 7:47 a.m., I sent my resignation email. It went to my father and my mother, though she technically had no role at the firm Preston and the firm's general counsel. It was brief. 2 pages, formally worded, and stated clearly that my resignation was effective immediately. I offered no emotion, no accusation, no explanation, only the work, the part they would feel most when it was gone. I didn't wait for replies. I powered down my computer and stood in the stillness of my home office, scanning the shelves one last time. Every degree, every award, every case file I had kept out of habit, I left it all. The only thing I took with me was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to my mentor, Marion Teller, a pioneer in forensic analysis and the first woman I ever saw take the stand in federal court and bend it to her will with logic and numbers alone. She once told me, when people erase you, let them for a while. Just long enough for them to realize what they can't rebuild. I pulled on a blazer not for anyone else, just for myself, respecting the exit. I took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the morning light. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel bitter. I felt precise, like a scalpel that had just completed its final incision. My phone buzzed as I was halfway through my first coffee. I ignored it. Then came another. Then a third, this one from Jared Kim, a senior partner at Ellison Grant & Co., one of the Big Four firms. I'd done independent advisory work with them 3 years prior. They'd been circling ever since. Dr. Hartley, he said when I finally answered. Tell me the rumor isn't true. That depends, I replied. What's the rumor that you just walked away from Hartley and Associates, and that you left quietly, which tells me it wasn't voluntary? I didn't respond. Well, he continued, we've got a consulting position open. It's project-based high-level advisory. No politics, no family, full autonomy. Double what you were likely making plus options if it turns into something permanent. I blinked. You're not even going to ask what happened? He laughed. I don't need to. I've met your brother. We agreed to connect in 2 days. I didn't accept on the spot. Not because I wasn't tempted, but because I knew better than to move just to escape something. I needed to know what I was running toward. Back home, I poured another coffee and sat on the balcony. The fall breeze cut through my blouse, but I didn't move. I let it sting. I needed to feel the edges of the moment, what it meant to truly walk away. Not just from the firm, but from the version of myself who had waited for permission to lead. That woman was gone. What was left was sharper, quieter, more dangerous in the best way. I pulled out a notebook and began mapping out what came next. Not just job offers, but possibilities. Advisory boards, expert testimony under my own name, maybe even starting my own practice. I'd always assumed Hartley and Associates would be my legacy. But what if it wasn't? What if my legacy was what came after? Later that evening, I forwarded my resignation to a few colleagues I trusted. Nina Alvarez, our lead data analyst, and Tom Partridge, a litigator we frequently partnered with on class action prep. I didn't say much, just wanted you to hear it from me directly. Nina replied instantly. They've lost their mind. Let me know if you're taking clients. Tom's reply was even shorter. When not, if you build your own, I'm in. I smiled, not because I needed their affirmation, but because I knew exactly what would happen next. The firm would try to run without me. At first, it might look stable, but soon the numbers would shift. Reports wouldn't reconcile. Forecasts would fail. Preston would patch it with buzzwords, flashy decks, and branding language that sounded great in theory and collapsed under audit. And then they'd come looking. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but eventually they'd realize the difference between confidence and competence, between style and structure. I wouldn't gloat when that moment came. I'd be ready, because I hadn't left in anger. I'd left in precision. 3 weeks after I left Hartley and Associates, the firm's website changed overnight. I hadn't planned to check it. I was in the middle of drafting a proposal for a large advisory contract with Ellison Grant & Co. and sipping a late afternoon espresso when the ping of a message from Nina Alvarez lit up the corner of my screen. You've got to see this. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Attached was a screenshot of the firm's homepage. I clicked. The new design was something. Gone was the subtle navy and silver palette we'd spent months refining to reflect credibility and gravitas. In its place, vibrant neon gradients, a hero banner with animated bar graphs bouncing to the beat of some techno-jazz hybrid, and Preston, my brother, front and center arms folded across a blazer worn over a hoodie standing in front of a backdrop that looked suspiciously like a WeWork lounge. Beneath him, bold lettering declared, "Justice is a vibe." I nearly choked on my espresso. Scrolling down, I found embedded videos, slick, fast-cut TikTok reels with Preston explaining financial forensics for the attention economy, tossing around phrases like emotional capital disruption theory and real-time justice metrics. None of it meant anything. And yet, it was presented with so much polish, so much bravado that I could imagine the untrained eye thinking it was visionary. But I knew better. Behind the flash, I could already see the rot. Later that day, Tom Partridge, the litigator I'd worked with on a dozen federal class actions, called. No small talk. You seen what he's done, just did. He pitched my partners on a multi-case crypto litigation campaign, Tom said. Told them Hartley could handle it end to end. Camille. We don't even know how to define damages in crypto yet. That space is a regulatory landmine. What did they say they're not biting? But the fact he thought he could bluff through that tells me he's either dangerously naive or incredibly reckless. I wanted to say both, but I held back. I hadn't spoken to Preston since I left. I didn't plan to. What I did hear through texts, quiet pings, and short calls from former colleagues was that the changes had come quickly and chaotically. Within 5 days of my resignation, Preston had dismissed Monica Reyes, our long-standing compliance officer. She'd been with the firm for nearly a decade and knew the ins and outs of federal documentation better than any auditor I'd met. Her dismissal email sent firm-wide simply read, "We are restructuring to promote agility." A week later, he dissolved the internal review committee that had overseen all high-risk case analysis. Too many bottlenecks, he said in a Slack message someone forwarded to me. Let's trust the team. Speed matters more than perfection. That statement I knew would not age well. He pushed the team into marketing personal injury settlements, something we'd never specialized in, claiming the visual storytelling would resonate better with digital-first juries. He hired 2 social media interns, not analysts, not economists, interns. And then he gave them access to our active caseload dashboards. Efficiency through democratization, he reportedly said. By week 3, I received an encrypted email from Aaron Chiang, one of the firm's junior analysts. He had always been reserved, sharp, meticulous, nervous around authority. The message was short, but it carried weight. Hi, Dr. Hartley. I know you're gone, and I don't mean to overstep, but something's not right. Deadlines are moving targets now. Preston wants data turned around without double checks. Said he'd clean up the narrative later. The modeling team is exhausted. We're guessing half the time. People are scared. Just thought you should know. I stared at his email, feeling my jaw tense. This wasn't just branding fluff anymore. This was malpractice in slow motion. Another message came that evening, this one from Marcy Bell, the lead case coordinator who'd been at the firm since before I joined. They removed the version history tracking from the client portal today. Said it was slowing things down. Camille, that system was built to protect us. If something goes wrong, there's no traceability anymore. No version history, no paper trail, no way to prove who changed what or when. It was a compliance nightmare. I could feel the walls beginning to buckle. Still, I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to step back into the mess. Not yet. Letting it crumble felt like justice. But watching it happen, knowing innocent people were inside, was a different kind of pain. I poured a glass of wine that night and sat by the window watching the city lights flicker across the bay. For the first time, since resigning, I felt something unfamiliar. Not vindication, not bitterness, something closer to mourning. I hadn't just left a firm, I'd left a family of professionals who had trusted me to lead, and now they were trapped in a machine run by someone who thought hashtags could replace accountability. I took a slow sip, then opened my laptop. I pulled up the backup file. All of it, my compliance tree, the forecast protocols, the historical case, success metrics, the proprietary valuation models still sat there. Untouched, untainted. Like a fireproof safe waiting for someone to remember the combination. I wasn't ready to act, but I was ready to watch. And I knew one thing with unshakable certainty. When the numbers started to fall apart, they'd come looking, and I'd be the only one holding the map. The story broke quietly, just a 3-paragraph bulletin on a niche legal news site. Most wouldn't have noticed it. But I had alerts set up for any mention of Hartley and Associates in federal court filings. Old habit. One I hadn't bothered to turn off. The headline read, DOJ pushes back on economic damages report in Rising Sun Tech versus U.S. CITES methodological failures. At first, I assumed it was another garden variety dispute over damages in a government contract breach. But as I clicked the link and read the details, the chill began creeping up my spine. Rising Suntech was one of the flashy new clients Preston had boasted about online, an AI startup that claimed their proprietary technology had been unlawfully deprioritized in a federal procurement process. The damages, A-bold, $120 million. The expert report backing that figure, produced by Hartley and Associates, submitted 3 days prior. As I scanned the DOJ's response, the words burned into my screen. Methodology presented by the plaintiff's economic expert is fundamentally flawed, lacking traceability, source documentation, or compliance with Daubert standards. Further, the expert fails to disclose the modeling structure, citing intuitive weighting as justification. I sat up straighter. Intuitive weighting was not a recognized economic method. It wasn't even a phrase I'd ever heard used professionally. It was the kind of language you'd find in a marketing deck, not a federal damages report. And worse, the footnote cited my methodology, not by name, but by reference. I pulled the court filing and scrolled through the attached exhibits. There it was, analytical framework adapted from the Hartley predictive value grid. That was my model. My name wasn't on the report itself, but my system had been invoked to give it credibility. They'd taken my framework, stripped out its integrity, and used it to dress up junk data. I stared at the screen, blood draining from my face. An hour later, a motion was filed by DOJ attorneys requesting the court to strike the report entirely and consider sanctions against the submitting firm for presenting a manipulated and untraceable methodology that could be interpreted as intentionally misleading. I didn't move for a full minute. Sanctions weren't just slaps on the wrist. If a federal judge ruled that Hartley and Associates had knowingly submitted a fraudulent economic analysis, the firm could be blacklisted from future federal engagements. Clients would flee. Referrals would dry up. Worse, my name, my intellectual property, was still tied to it in the public record. That same afternoon, I received the first of several calls. I didn't answer. Then came the message from George Hartley. He didn't leave a voicemail, just a text. "Call me. It's urgent." I ignored it. 10 minutes later, another ping. "Please, Camille. This is serious. It's about a federal motion. We need to talk." Still, I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled up Pacer and downloaded the judge's latest order. My heart sank. The court had scheduled an emergency hearing on the admissibility of the damages report and had summoned both the submitting economist and the firm's founding partner. That meant Preston and George. The firm was being called to account in open court. I didn't want to feel satisfaction, but part of me did. They had dismissed me, replaced experience with flash. And now they were about to learn publicly, irrevocably, that federal litigation was not a game. By the next morning, legal Twitter had picked up the story. The phrase intuitive modeling started trending among white-collar defense attorneys. One anonymous comment read, "This is what happens when influencer energy meets federal court. Sanctions incoming." I received another call this time from Marcy Bell, the case coordinator who'd messaged me weeks before. "Camille," she said, "not bothering with pleasantries, we're in trouble." I kept my voice neutral. Define we. Preston's been in his office all morning yelling. George came in for the first time in weeks. He looks 10 years older. No one knows what to do. The entire audit team is frozen. The Rising Sun team just pulled their remaining invoice payments, and I just got off the phone with one of our other clients, Catalyst Holdings. They're asking to pause their engagement until this clears up. Catalyst was worth $3 million annually. How many others? I asked. 3 so far. And I'm hearing rumors that Waldron Legal might be looking for new analysts. That was our biggest client. If they pulled out too, I exhaled. Thanks for the heads up. I hung up before she could say more. The next message came from Preston. "Cam, I know we haven't talked, but I need to explain. It's not what it looks like. I can fix it. Please call me." He sounded desperate. That part was new, but it wasn't the calls or the messages that finally broke my silence. It was a small detail buried in the federal court's preliminary order that caught my eye. A footnote. Again, the economic analysis references the Hartley Predictive Value Grid, HPVG, originally developed by Dr. Camille Hartley, whose credentials and experience appear substantially more extensive than the submitting expert. The judge had noticed. My name was back in play, but not in the way I wanted. I stared at that footnote for a long time because I knew exactly what was coming next. If sanctions were upheld, my name would be cited as the origin point of a methodology now accused of misleading the U.S. government. Preston had built a rocket out of buzzwords and launched it using my name as fuel. And now it was crashing back to Earth. And if I didn't intervene at least to separate fact from fiction, it would leave a permanent burn on everything I'd built. I sat in my apartment that night staring at the skyline, knowing what I needed to do. I wasn't doing it for George or for Preston. I was doing it for myself because if I didn't reclaim the narrative now, they'd write it for me. And I had worked far too hard to let that happen. The second call came, just after 9 the next morning. I didn't need to check the caller ID. The vibration of the phone on the table was enough. I let it ring once, twice, and then answered. Camille, my father's voice said. It sounded thinner than I remembered. I know I've already asked. I wouldn't be calling again if it wasn't serious. I didn't say anything. I've spoken to counsel, he continued. If the audit committee rules the report misleading, and they might, we're looking at a 5-year exclusion from any federal contracts. That's everything. Half our revenue, maybe more. Preston didn't understand what he was doing. That much is clear, I replied. He hesitated. The judge's footnote mentions your name, the grid. They're going to call it into question. If you don't step in, my name wouldn't be in this at all if you hadn't let someone else distort my work, I said calmly. So let's not pretend I owe you damage control. I'm not asking for you to clean it up, he said, and for the first time, there was a rawness in his voice. I'm asking you to come home, before it all collapses. Home. The word didn't sit right. The firm had been my home until they made it clear it wasn't. I closed my eyes for a moment. He wasn't wrong about the urgency, but this wasn't about sentiment anymore. This was business. I'll think about it, I said at last, then hung up. I didn't call Preston. Instead, I called someone I trusted, Ari Goldman, a regulatory attorney I'd worked with over the years on high-risk government matters. A sharp mind. Zero tolerance for BS. He answered on the second ring. Camille Hartley. Thought I'd hear from you sooner. You've seen the Rising Sun filing, I asked. I've read it. 3 times. That expert report is a flaming mess. I didn't sign it, I said. I know. But they name your methodology. You've got some exposure if this gets ugly. More importantly, so does your credibility. What happens if the audit committee rules against the firm, best case? They're blacklisted from any federal contract work for 5 years. Worst case, the DOJ flags it for review and recommends civil penalties. Would I be pulled into that? Not if you formally disassociate now, he said. But if you go back and help clean it up and do it visibly, you could not only protect your name, but restore the firm's viability. You'd have leverage, real leverage. I paused. That's assuming I even want to go back. You don't, he said flatly. You want control, and this is how you get it. After the call, I stepped out onto my balcony. It was a crisp morning, unusually still for a city that usually buzzed by 7 a.m. I stared across the rooftops, trying to imagine what it would feel like to walk back into that office, not as the ghost of the past, but as its future. The thought wasn't sentimental, it was strategic. I had something they didn't clarity, and if they wanted my help, it would be on my terms. By midday, I typed a message. Short, professional. I'm willing to meet. 10 a.m. tomorrow. Marlowe and Finch Conference Center. Just you, me, and legal counsel. No Preston. The reply came within 2 minutes. Understood. I'll be there. Thank you. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing, not emotionally, but tactically. I reviewed the firm's recent filings, confirmed the number of clients who had paused engagements, checked internal metrics on employee attrition. Someone from the compliance team had quietly sent me the most recent staff retention report. 30% of the workforce was actively interviewing elsewhere. The firm wasn't just on fire, it was down to its foundation. The next morning, I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, and chose a quiet corner conference room with glass walls and blinds half closed. I wore charcoal gray, sharp professional unyielding, and carried nothing but a notepad. George entered right at 10. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. No suit, just a wrinkled shirt, a tie askew, and shoulders that had lost their posture. He sat without greeting. "I'm here," I said, "because I don't want to see good people lose their livelihoods. But let's be clear, this isn't a favor. This is business." He nodded slowly. "Fair. I've already spoken to legal. If this audit goes badly, the firm's value drops to nothing. You'll lose every federal client within the quarter. No one's going to hire a firm under government review." "I know," he said quietly. "Preston's report isn't just unprofessional. It's dangerous. He manipulated data to fit a narrative, and he used my model's name to sell it. I never intended for that, but you allowed it." I interrupted. "You let someone with no qualifications assume leadership because he was family. You gave him full authority without oversight, and now you're standing in front of me asking for help. So here's what you need to understand. If I come back, I don't want a seat." He looked at me confused. "I want the table," I said, evenly. 51% controlling ownership, full operational authority, a restructured board with independent oversight, Preston removed from all executive functions. His mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but nothing came out. I leaned forward. "You don't get to hand the car keys to your son, crash it into a courthouse, and then ask me to drive unless I own the car. You want this fixed? You put me in charge." Completely. Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he spoke. "You've already made up your mind." "No," I said. "I've made a proposal. Whether it becomes reality is up to you." He nodded slowly, the weight of it all seeming to collapse onto him. "You sound more like a CEO than I ever did." "I am." I stood. "You have until tomorrow to agree in principle. After that, I walk, and I don't look back." As I left the room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted, and I intended to use it. The meeting was set for Saturday morning at the Garden Room in the Park Row Hotel, a neutral ground just upscale enough to keep voices low and tempers civil. I chose it deliberately. Private booths, strong coffee, and windows tall enough to make you feel watched, even when you weren't. I arrived early as always and took the corner booth farthest from the kitchen noise. My notepad was closed in front of me, but my mind had already rehearsed the script a dozen times. Not just what I'd say, but how I'd sit when I'd pause, which moments needed eye contact and which required silence. Negotiation wasn't about facts, it was about leverage. And this time, I wasn't negotiating from the sidelines. At 10:02, George entered, followed by my mother and then Preston, looking like he'd just walked out of a men's fashion blog, expensive knit sweater, sharp haircut, that same performative ease he always carried when he wanted to appear unbothered. But the puffiness around his eyes gave him away. He hadn't slept. My mother greeted me with a soft, uncertain smile. "Camille, thank you for meeting us." I gave her a polite nod but said nothing. My attention stayed on my father. He opened first, his voice steadier than it had been the last time. "Thank you for coming. I know this hasn't been easy." "It's not supposed to be," I replied. "I want to say, up front, we made a mistake." He continued, "A serious one. We let emotion cloud judgment. And we put the firm and your work in jeopardy. But if you're willing to return, we can fix this. Together." I looked at each of them, Dad, Mom, Preston, and then carefully placed my hand over the closed notepad. "I'm not coming back to be the cleanup crew," I said. "I'm not coming back as a favor or to patch holes someone else punched through the hull. If I return, it's as the person steering the ship. No caveats, no compromises." Preston let out a breathy laugh. "Here it comes." I turned to him calmly. "Yes, here it comes." Then I opened the notebook and began. First, 51% controlling ownership of Hartley and Associates. Not symbolic. Actual legal documented control. My father shifted in his seat. My mother blinked. Second, full operational authority. That means I decide staffing clients, strategic direction, and internal processes. No vetoes. No oversight from family. Preston's eyebrows arched. "You want to own the company and run it alone?" "No," I said. "I want to run it competently. There's a difference." I turned back to my list. Third, a fully independent compliance board. External auditors, quarterly reviews, No more unilateral decisions made by unqualified voices. My mother cleared her throat gently. Camille, that's significant. It needs to be, I said. Because the last time I trusted this family to make decisions about the business, I ended up watching my methodology used to submit a fraudulent report to a federal court. My father lowered his gaze. And finally I said, Preston is removed from all executive functions immediately. He retains no decision-making authority, no client-facing responsibilities. He can keep a symbolic stake no more than 5%, but he doesn't speak for the firm. Ever again. That was when Preston exploded. You're using this crisis to steal the company, he snapped. You waited for it to implode so you could swoop in and crown yourself queen. I didn't blink. You already stole it, I said, voice steady. You took something you didn't understand, wrecked it, and dragged my name down with it. I'm not here to gloat, Preston. I'm here to offer a way out. You should thank me for not walking away. My mother reached for my father's arm. George, he held up his hand. I need a moment, he said quietly. We sat in silence. The buzz of the espresso machine in the distance, the clink of silverware, a business couple talking softly 2 tables over. Life continuing indifferent to the fault lines under our table. Then my father looked up. You'll have it, he said. All of it. Preston stared at him. You're just going to give her the company. No, George replied. She's not asking for it. She's earning it by being the only person left who can keep it alive. Preston pushed back his chair and stood. This is insane. You're both insane. He walked out without another word. My mother started to rise, but I stopped her with a glance. Let him go, I said. He needs to learn what consequences feel like. She sat back down, looking both heartbroken and relieved. A quiet grief, the kind you carry when you realize the damage has already been done, and the only thing left is to choose which piece of the wreckage is worth saving. My father reached across the table. Not for my hand, he knew better, but to slide the notepad toward himself. He reviewed the terms, again nodded once. I'll have the attorneys draw it up. Monday. I stood. One more thing, you don't get to change your mind mid-process. This isn't a discussion we revisit in 6 months. He nodded again. Understood. I turned to leave, then paused. You made a decision once based on legacy. This time, make it based on logic. I'm not asking for the company because I'm your daughter. I'm demanding it because I'm the only one who knows how to fix it. And then I walked out the door, closing behind me with a satisfying weight. No fanfare, no applause, just the sound of a shift, long overdue clicking into place. I walked back into Hartley and Associates on a Monday morning, 47 days after I'd left it behind. But in those 6 weeks, the place had aged years. The lobby plants were dead. The receptionist desk was empty. Half the light fixtures in the hallway flickered overhead like a bad omen. Gone was the quiet hum of productive intensity I used to love. What remained felt hollow like a stage after the cast had abandoned the play mid-performance. The air smelled faintly of cheap cologne and burned coffee. No one greeted me when I stepped off the elevator. I wasn't surprised. I made my way to the executive floor. My old office, once a hub of analytics diagrams and case binders, was stripped clean, its contents hastily shoved into boxes in the corner. I didn't bother unpacking. I'd work from the war room. Before sitting down, I gathered a list of every active client account over 500K, then I started making calls, one by one. No spin, no sugar, just facts. Hi, this is Dr. Camille Hartley. I've resumed operational leadership at the firm. Pause. Relief on the other end. I know the last few weeks have been turbulent. You have my full attention now. I reassured, clarified, and repromised. I told the truth plainly. Yes, there had been internal disruption. No, Preston was no longer in charge. Yes, I had resumed control with a mandate to stabilize and rebuild. And no, none of their data or filings would move forward without my direct review. Most clients were cautious but willing to wait. Some, like Waldron Legal and Catalyst Holdings, expressed guarded optimism. A few simply said, "We've been hoping you'd come back." It was a start. By lunchtime, I had called 7 major clients, secured 3 formal continuations, and scheduled a week's worth of follow-up presentations. I hadn't eaten, hadn't paused, hadn't even looked at my inbox. There was no time for anything but triage. That afternoon, I moved into what we used to call the bunker, our private analytics room used during live trials. It was windowless, silent, and perfect for what I needed next. I opened the encrypted backup I'd preserved the night I resigned the complete compliance and audit framework I had designed over the past 5 years. It had been the spine of the firm's credibility. Preston, in his rush to modernize, had dismantled it. But I had saved it just in case. And now the case had come. The audit ran automatically comparing report metadata model parameters and case notes across every engagement signed since I left. The results came in by late evening. Of the 22 active reports submitted under Preston's tenure, 9 contained undisclosed alterations to the methodology framework. 4 had missing source citations. 2 included speculative multipliers with no supporting documentation, and 1 rising sun tech had data completely fabricated from projected market expansion scenarios that were never peer-reviewed. I stared at the screen, emotionless. This wasn't just sloppy, it was legally actionable. But I wasn't going to destroy the firm from the inside. I wasn't there to punish, I was there to protect what was left. So I did the one thing that could shield us. I wrote an affidavit, 2 pages, carefully worded, signed, and dated. It outlined the existence of a preserved compliance system. It stated that I had stepped away from the firm prior to the submission of any challenge reports. It confirmed that the current leadership, namely Preston, had removed the internal audit layers without authorization or oversight. And critically, it included a clear plan for how we were restoring those systems with immediate effect. The document was factual, unemotional, and positioned the firm as a recovering entity, not a fraudulent one. I called Ari Goldman again and asked if he'd review it before I submitted it to the court. He read it in 15 minutes and called me back. "This is clean," he said. "Better than clean. This gives the judge exactly what she needs to pause the sanctions process. You've positioned yourself as the adult in the room. That's the goal. Camille," he added, lowering his voice, "this also gives you something else precedent. You're on the record now as the one who stepped in, identified the damage, and corrected it. Legally, you're now the firewall between Preston's recklessness and the firm's survival." I hung up, sent the affidavit to the court via our external counsel, and then sat back for the first time that day. The office was quiet. Outside, the sun had dipped below the skyline, throwing streaks of burnt orange against the concrete. Somewhere in the building, I heard the distant buzz of a vacuum and the occasional cough of a late-shift paralegal. And for the first time in months, I felt something unfamiliar. Control. Not in the abstract sense, not as a title or a placeholder or a hollow promise handed out at a dinner table. Real control, rooted in competence, backed by evidence. I still had a long road ahead, clients to win back, staff to stabilize, and a brand to rebuild, but I also had the one thing no one else in that building did, a map back to credibility. And now, the power to use it. The federal courthouse in D.C. looked the same as it always had, dignified, towering, wrapped in cool stone and silence, but this time, I walked in differently. Not as the quiet specialist tucked behind exhibits or seated 2 chairs behind lead counsel. Not as someone supporting the message. I walked in as the message itself. Courtroom 6B was already half full when I arrived. Reporters from legal outlets sat in the back row murmuring quietly. Counsel for both the Department of Justice and Rising Sun Tech were already reviewing exhibits. Preston sat at the defense table fidgeting with his tie, his face pale and drawn. He didn't look at me when I entered. I didn't expect him to. Our counsel, a sharp, calm litigator named Deirdre Hahn, greeted me with a nod and whispered, "Judge Compton's clerk told us she's read your affidavit. We'll still need you on record, but tone will likely be soft. You did us a favor." I nodded once, then took my seat behind the defense table, my notepad in hand, even though I wouldn't be allowed to use it on the stand. I wasn't nervous. My hands didn't shake. I'd spent my career translating complexity into clarity. This was just another room that needed the truth explained cleanly. The judge entered. Everyone rose. After initial motions, Judge Compton, a woman with a reputation for brutal logic and an allergy to performative fluff, turned her attention to the matter at hand. I've reviewed the motion to strike the expert economic report submitted by the plaintiff, Rising Sun Tech. She began, her voice as dry as dust. The court acknowledges significant concerns with the report's methodology, its deviation from standard practices, and the vague attribution to a framework referred to as the Hartley Predictive Value Grid. She turned to our table. Dr. Hartley, I understand you've returned to operational leadership and submitted a sworn affidavit concerning this methodology. I stood. Yes, Your Honor. You'll take the stand, please. I walked slowly, deliberately, and took my seat. The oath was familiar. I spoke it without hesitation. Deirdre began her questions as rehearsed. Dr. Hartley, can you clarify whether the methodology referenced in the Rising Sun report reflects your original framework? No, it does not, I said clearly. While it uses language from my published work, the structure of the report deviates significantly from the established HPVG standards. Critical elements such as comparative baselines, third-party data verification, and internal control documentation were removed or never applied. Were you aware this altered methodology was being submitted under your name? No. Had you approved this version in any way? I had resigned from the firm before the report was drafted. I was not consulted. I had no knowledge of its submission. Deirdre nodded. In your professional opinion, does this report meet the standards required for admissibility under Daubert? No, it does not. There was a murmur behind me, soft but sharp. Deirdre concluded with the affidavit. Your Honor, the defense submits this sworn statement by Dr. Hartley outlining the original methodology, the deviations in this case, and the corrective measures now underway. Judge Compton took it skim through and then turned to the plaintiff's counsel. Any objections? The DOJ attorney, an older man with steel hair and thin glasses, stood. None. Dr. Hartley's clarification aligns with our own expert review. The issue is not with her model, it's with the plaintiff's application of it. The judge looked unimpressed. And the so-called expert who submitted this report, Mr. Preston Hartley, is he present? Preston stood reluctantly. Yes, Your Honor. She studied him for a moment. Mr. Hartley, what are your qualifications in forensic economics? Preston's mouth opened, then closed. I've studied financial markets independently, and I've developed engagement strategies. That's not what I asked. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. I don't have formal qualifications in economics, no. Judge Compton sighed. Then this court will officially strike your report from the record and dismiss the motion to admit it. The court will also dismiss with prejudice the request for sanctions against Hartley and Associates based on the clear separation of roles and the remediation measures already in place under Dr. Hartley's leadership. Bang. Gavel. Just like that, it was done. Preston sank back into his chair. I didn't look at him. There was nothing left to say. After court adjourned, I stepped into the hallway only to find Tom Partridge, our longtime legal collaborator, waiting for me. Camille, he said, shaking his head with a crooked smile. Hell of a recovery. Wasn't luck, I said. Didn't think it was. Look, if you're back in charge, my firm's ready to re-engage. Our GC just needs a signed letter confirming Preston's out. He's out, I confirmed. One handshake, one contract on its way back. Then came Elaine Wu, General Counsel for Catalyst Holdings. She'd walked away from us the moment the Rising Sun mess hit the wire. She approached me cautiously. I watched your testimony, she said. Clear. Controlled. The kind of leadership I wish we'd seen earlier. We're not looking backward, I said. Only forward. Well, she said, extending her hand, if you're running it, we're back in. The messages came quickly after that. My inbox lit up over the next few hours. Waldron Legal, Grady, and Kim Fisher-Connolly. One after another. Clients who'd paused projects or gone silent now reappearing, asking for case timelines. Updated proposals verification of Preston's removal. The tide was turning. Quietly. Precisely. Back at the office, I stood in the war room looking out the narrow window as the city moved past below me. My team, what remained of it, was already busy reassembling protocols, scheduling audits, notifying clients. We had just survived a courtroom that could have buried us. But we didn't just survive, we reset. Not with an apology, with clarity, not with promises, with proof. The firm still bore my last name, and now, finally, it bore my standards. The fire Preston started had nearly destroyed us. But fire also clarifies. It burns away what's weak, and what's left, if you're lucky, is strong enough to rebuild on your terms. The first to return was Marcy Bell, our veteran case coordinator. She walked into my office on a Wednesday afternoon, no appointment, no fanfare. Just a quiet knock and the words, "If you're still rebuilding, I'd like to help." I looked up from my screen. "Are you sure?" She gave a small, tired smile. I stayed through Preston's live-streamed brainstorming sessions and watched a junior associate get promoted for suggesting we do damage models in reels. "Trust me, I'm sure." I stood and shook her hand. It was the first of many. Over the next 2 weeks, familiar faces began to reappear. Some had already started new jobs but called asking if there was space for them again. Others had hung on through the chaos, watching from behind cubicle walls while the company they'd trusted teetered under flash and ego. This time, I didn't just rehire, I restructured. We filed the paperwork to convert Hartley and Associates into an LLP limited liability partnership with a shared leadership model built on transparency, not legacy. I appointed 2 new partners, Dr. Evelyn Carter, who'd led our impact assessments before being pushed aside by Preston's crypto detour, and Talia Ramirez, a fierce litigation strategist we'd nearly lost during the exodus. Both women had been undervalued during the firm's rebranding era. Now, they held real ownership, full voting rights, and a mandate to co-lead, not just support. Our internal handbook was rewritten from the ground up. I built in a mandatory mentorship rotation that paired new hires with cross-functional veterans. No more sink-or-swim culture. We instituted blind recruitment on all new economic analyst roles. Resume came in without names, schools or affiliations, just performance-based experience and case samples. For the first time, the office didn't feel like it was run by inheritance. It felt earned. Preston was officially removed from all operational roles. He retained a 5% equity share purely symbolic and non-voting, along with a signed agreement barring him from representing the firm in any capacity. He didn't fight it. He didn't even show up to sign. His attorney mailed it in. Mom emailed me once after that. Short, just one line. "I'm proud of what you've done. I hope he learns from this." I didn't respond. Not out of bitterness, just clarity. I was no longer tethered to what they wished I had been. Clients returned steadily. Not all, but enough. Enough to keep the lights on, pay our people fairly, and rebuild a reputation that now felt like mine in more than just name. We took fewer cases, but the right ones. We leaned into areas we'd mastered before Preston's detour: federal infrastructure litigation, structured settlement, arbitration compliance audits, quiet, unglamorous work that required real expertise. Then came the email from Forbes. It landed in my inbox under the subject line, "Feature, Opportunity, Camille Hartley." I almost deleted it, but curiosity got the better of me. The writer Delia Knox had covered business turnarounds for years, especially women in leadership who weren't handed the keys but had to fight for them. She'd followed the court hearing, seen the client recovery stats, and wanted to write about the story behind the headlines. I met her for coffee in a small cafe across from Judiciary Square. She was sharp, respectful, and didn't ask about Preston until the very end. "So, do you see him now?" "No," I said simply, "and I'm not the one who needs to." She smiled, nodded, and closed her notebook. The piece ran 2 weeks later under the headline, "The Woman Who Reclaimed Her Name and Her Firm." It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like confirmation of what I'd always known but needed to prove. That legacy without discipline is just weight. That merit can be quiet and still win. And that rebuilding doesn't mean returning. It means reimagining what should have existed all along. In the final paragraph, Delia wrote, Camille Hartley didn't just take back a company, she redefined it. Not for applause, for endurance. In a city full of legacy names, hers now stands not just for what was, but for what's next. And this time, I kept the magazine. Not for the shelf, for the staff lounge. The sunlight hit the office just right that morning. It pooled through the east-facing windows of the war room, my office, now casting long gold lines across the glass conference table. There were no more boxes in the corners, no flickering light panels, no ghost of Preston's glossy rebrand. Just quiet order, just presence, just work. A year had passed since the courtroom. 11 months since the restructuring. 10 since the last of the compliance audits cleared us with full reinstatement. 7 since our biggest returning client signed a 5-year renewal. And 5 since I'd stopped waking up at 3 a.m. expecting a headline to undo everything I'd repaired. The firm was smaller now, on purpose. We operated lean, clean, and loud only when it counted. Evelyn and Talia had taken their roles with force and grace, balancing me in ways I hadn't known I needed. The staff was younger in some ways, but sharper, more collaborative. We had culture now. Not a poster slogan, a pulse. On the Friday before the Women in Business keynote, I met my father for lunch. His idea. Neutral spot again, a quiet corner booth at Linden Grill. He was early. I could tell by the way he sat. Not fidgeting, just waiting. That was new. "You look rested," he said when I arrived. "Efficiency does that," I said, taking my seat. Fewer fires to put out. He nodded, and we let the silence settle between us like an old coat we both recognized. "How's your mother?" I asked. "She's good," he said. "Still thinks I should have named the firm after you 5 years ago." I gave a small smile. "She's not wrong." "No," he said quietly. "She's not." The waiter came and went. I ordered tea. He ordered a BLT, no mayo. He was always weirdly specific about that. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down. "I want to say something," he said, "and I don't expect anything in return." I looked at him carefully. "Go on." "I was raised to believe men lead," he said. I never questioned that. Not because I thought women couldn't, but because no one around me did. It was just assumed. I passed that down to you and to Preston. And I see now how deep that mistake ran. I thought giving him the firm was honoring my legacy, but I wasn't protecting it. I was sabotaging it, and I'm sorry. There was no flourish in his voice, no dramatic pause, just plain honesty. I appreciate that I said. And I meant it. But I also meant what came next, but I won't forget it. He nodded. "I don't want you to." We talked a little longer about the firm, the future, the new mentorship program, and the staff we'd brought on from the HBCU internship pipeline we launched last quarter. He asked questions, he listened. That was the real shift. Not that he admired me now, but that he finally heard me. I paid the bill. Not to prove a point, but because I could, and because it felt like a full circle. Best closed on my terms. That night, I reviewed the final draft of my keynote. The National Conference for Women in Business had extended the invitation months ago after the Forbes article. But I hadn't said yes until I was sure the firm didn't need me in crisis mode anymore. Now, it needed me in legacy mode. The ballroom at the Madison Center was packed rows of women in every shade of ambition. College students, mid-career managers, CEOs, nonprofit founders, investors. I walked to the stage with no nerves, just purpose. They introduced me, simply Dr. Camille Hartley, managing partner, Hartley and Hartley LLP. I stepped up, took the mic, and looked out over 1,000 faces who understood exactly what it meant to be underestimated. I spent 10 years building a company I began. Then I watched it handed to someone else with no qualifications because he was next in line. And for a moment, I thought maybe that was the end of my story. A few knowing murmurs rolled through the crowd. But it wasn't, I continued. Because your value doesn't disappear just because others don't see it. Your contribution doesn't get erased because someone puts their name over yours. I paused, letting the weight of that land. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is leave so that when you return on your terms. With receipts, with strategy, with boundaries. Applause, now sustained, but I held steady. I didn't come back to be liked. I came back to lead, and leadership, real leadership, doesn't wait for permission. It builds the damn door. Louder applause now. A few people stood. I didn't shift tone, I closed the way I always intended. If your value isn't recognized, walk. And when you return, make sure the door opens on your terms. Because legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you refuse to compromise. I stepped down to a standing ovation, but that wasn't the reward. The reward came 3 days later when I arrived at the office and the new signage had gone up. Not just the usual plaque on the lobby wall, but a brass plate on my door. Hartley and Hartley LLP Managing Partner, Dr. Camille Hartley. It was quiet, simple, permanent, not a reward, a redefinition.